I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused, where we talk about ideas that are outside the mainstream. My guest today is Charles C.W. Cooke of nationalreview.com. Thanks for coming on with me.
Thanks for having me.
So I think this is sort of a time when a lot of people on the right are sort of reevaluating the sort of ideological foundations of the right and asking, what do we stand for? What are we about? And that's an issue where I wanted to talk to you specifically about what it's like to be an atheist on the right, which is a boat that I think we're both in. And we're not alone, are we? I mean, there's a sort of a subgroup of prominent people who are not religious believers who are on the right.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to ask what sort of atheist a person is, and that affects how they interact with the right. I always like George Will's description of himself as a low voltage atheist. I am that too. I mean, I'm not an agnostic. I'm not somebody who is sort of pantheist. I do not believe in God. So I actively don't believe in God, but I also don't care. And I think that probably matters. I think if you don't believe in God but are angry with him, then it would be more difficult to be on the right. So the only point at which this affects me, and this does happen occasionally, is when people say, well, you can't be a conservative and an atheist.
Right.
And that does happen from time to time, but in general, it doesn't. And I think that matters. That I'm not sort of against religion.
Well, I think I call that sort of the Catholic school atheists. It is
right.
You know, the most fanatical atheists I know were people who went to Catholic school, and their sort of fanaticism about it is they're still trying to get back at the nuns.
Yeah.
They had it shoved down their throat in some unpleasant way and have a bad association with it, so they're out for revenge in a way.
Right, and that doesn't describe me at all. My schools were religious. My university was nominally religious, but it was never particularly important. Of course, the Church of England is not especially devout anyway. And so I always saw this as at worst a curiosity. I mean, it never affected me negatively. And I suppose in some ways I'm quite pro-religion. I don't, again, want one. I don't believe it's true. But I think that the question of religion and the question of conscience rights are inextricable. In fact, one of the things that I think is odd about many atheists who are not conservatives is how quickly they seem to, how prepared they seem to be to throw conscience rights overboard. And I think this is a mistake for a couple of reasons. The first is, I mean, of all the people in human history, the atheists should be the most in favor of conscience rights. But also because when I see somebody stand up and say something, either that I don't agree with or that I think is nuts religiously, I don't look at that and say, well, that's a threat or, well, that's unscientific primarily, although I could. I mostly look at that and say, well, isn't it great we live in a country in which that person is free to express that view or hold that view? And so as well as being sort of philosophically broadly in favor of religion as a social force, I'm also pleased that it thrives, and I mean that for all religions, not in the way some people say that to mean just Christianity. I mean for all religions, because to me that is a check on the state and also an example of a genuinely diverse, in the way the word should be used, society.
Well, let's think of this, and I want to start in terms of how it works for you personally. That is, the idea of being an atheist and being on the right or even being conservative is not a combination most people think is normal. So how do you combine those things? How do they fit together in your worldview?
Well, I mean, if I were being puckish, I would say that the same instincts that led me toward conservatism and libertarianism actually led me toward atheism, which is a general skepticism, a general distrust of authority and hierarchies, and the belief that I don't need anyone to sit between myself and power. If I were being more generous toward religion, I would say that contrary to the views that a few religious people who are less tolerant of atheists have, it's entirely possible to believe in natural rights and to believe there are lines that can't be crossed and to believe that there are moral precepts that should be universally accepted without believing that they come from a deity. I mean, something I get quite a lot is the question, well, if you don't believe in God, why do you think murder is wrong?
Right.
Well, I mean, I can believe in the sanctity of life, whatever that means, without believing that it is related to anything metaphysical or related to sort of infallible text. I think it is self-evident that that taking away people's lives against their will leads to a great deal of destruction, not only for the person whose life is being taken away or diminished, but for everyone around them. I think that is an obvious lesson of history.
Well, that's what I think of it often in terms of the lessons of history. That we have 5,000 years of human history in which we know we've tried out various different systems. We've seen how different ways of organizing a society work, and you can draw conclusions from that rationally and scientifically.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, this shouldn't be especially controversial. Firstly, if we're looking at American conservatism and its foundation in the Constitution, it is a fact that although some of the founders were religious, most of them either were not religious in a traditional sense, or were not religious in a way that would be accepted now. So it's not as if they had some special religious group that wrote the Constitution because it was dictated to them from on high. But I think the other thing is that it is the position of the Catholic Church, unless I'm mistaken, that the views that it holds, although divine, are also reachable by reason. So doesn't it follow that I could reach them, even if I don't believe in God? Now, they would say, well, there's the faith part of it, and I understand that. I know that it's not good enough for me to hold that position as far as the Catholic Church goes. But it is also true, according to them, that I can come to the same views via reason. So I don't know why we would assume we would need a religious component to any sort of conservative precept.
I think that's also something that's underestimated about the founding fathers. I think something you wrote, you had mentioned America might have turned out differently if instead of being founded by Christians, it was founded by followers of Spinoza. But on the other hand, what we really got was both. We got a country that was founded by people who were Christians, for the most part, but who were also devotees and influenced by Enlightenment philosophy. I mean, not just Jefferson, but Adams, and it was throughout America that the leading men of the time were engaged and involved in the Enlightenment ideas coming from Britain and just to a lesser extent from France. And so we had this sort of combination of they were Christian, but they also believed in nature and nature's God.
Yeah, and that matters because so many of them were deists. So I think that as an atheist, if you were to tell me that I should believe in God or religion, I think I would draw up a continuum and of what is the most likely and least likely to be true. So I can just about get on board with the deist idea. It is not much different than believing, for example, that the world is a simulation. So if you take the deist conception of the world, that holds that he did make the world, but then he left it alone. Executing systems, the weather, the Newtonian rotation, all of that. But he's not responding to your prayers, and he's not intervening. So that's on the one side of this continuum. And then all the way on the other side of the continuum are specific claims that are made about what happened a long time ago, specific claims made about what is moral and what is not, what is approved and what is not, what one has to do in order to obtain a place in the afterlife, and so on and so forth. And so, if you start with deism, you'd sort of move along, and then you would get sort of past lay preacher and into some of Protestantism, and all the way you get into this ornate high church and then Catholicism, if we're doing Christianity. And that's fine. I mean, my wife is a Catholic. I'm respectful of it. I'm really not. Some of the smartest people I know are devout, and I'm in no way condescending toward them. I don't look down on them. Maybe I'm wrong. But the founders, as you say, were actually not only were many of them not religious in a traditional sense, but a lot of them didn't have any of that ornate stuff. They just had the deism. Now, again, the skeptic would say, well, yes, and that made a lot more sense in 1800 because we didn't understand germ theory, we didn't understand quantum mechanics, all of that. But again, even if you don't hold that to be your worldview, they were not particularly steeped in anything that you would call prescriptive. And I would call them conservatives. I mean, they were radicals, but they were also conservatives. They believed in the Glorious Revolution. They believed in natural rights. They thought they were restoring ancient British ideals. And if I hold to the same viewpoint, why can't I be one too?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the American Revolution is the only revolution carried out by conservatives that I know of, where it was all about, we have this system we had all along. We're trying to restore it.
Yeah. Well, and that gets into this horrible semantic problem we have in America, which is if you are conservative of radicalism, what are you? Are you a conservative or are you a radical? And I would say that I am a radical, but I am also conservative of the constitutional order because it is radical, and I want to keep it that way. So, yeah, we have this problem, and so you end up with this this sort of annoying progressive talking point where they say, well, conservatives are on the wrong side of everything and progressives are on the right side of everything, right? Because but actually that's not really how it works. That's not how those intellectual and ideological lineages go. But it's more of a problem that in a classically liberal country than it is in a country like England.
How so?
Well, because in England, what you are protecting often contains an awful lot of illiberal presumptions, right? So if you're now this isn't always true. In fact, England is a worse example than most because it has that strain of liberalism in my sense of the word too.
Right.
But if you're a conservative in Austria throughout history, you've generally been involved in protecting the monarchy and protecting the aristocracy and protecting an established church and protecting the power structure as it existed.
You want the empire and the emperor back.
Yeah, you want the exactly. You want the emperor back. But if you're a conservative in America, you are interested in conserving some fairly radical, small R Republican ideas. For example, universal or almost untrammeled free speech, the right of the individual citizen to bear arms, arguments against state power that are contained within the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the freedom of the press to say whatever it likes about the powerful. These are not ideas that are conservative in any European sense. They're not always really related to maintaining order either,
right.
And which is why conservatives often get called anarchists.
And England is going to be, or Britain is going to be, a somewhat different case because, for example, the American founders were influenced by sort of British real Whig history, which always argued in terms of exactly what the founders said, which is this, all of British history is about liberty and protecting the prerogatives of the individual against the crown. Yeah. Now, you can argue about how accurate that history was, but they always argued in terms of being pro-liberty, but at the same time being based on English traditions.
I think that's right, although I would quibble slightly. I think one of the problems in England is that you have, for example, the parliamentarians of the late 18th century believed the Glorious Revolution was perfect. Edmund Burke, particularly, he believes it's perfect. And in order to believe the Glorious Revolution is perfect, you have to believe there's a place for the monarchy. And that place for the monarchy is sufficiently involved that we would in America not accept it. Right. And so you then have this bifurcated historical conception of the monarchy where you keep your Charles James Foxes and your Edmund Burkes on one side, and they say, yeah, there's some room for it. But then on the other side, you have a more high Tory conservatism that wants to keep the monarchy at the forefront of public life. In America, to find people who are essentially being conservatives of a different order, you have to go to the New Deal. I mean, that how I see modern progressives is essentially as conservatives of the New Deal, right? That's the Constitution and the order they want to maintain. That's what they think is sacrosanct. It's the second founding. Right. And it's popular in America politician who tries to overturn it is going to lose. But you still find a hell of a lot of young people whose sort of political awakening came from reading the Federalist Papers and the Constitution in a way that you don't find in most countries.
That's true. And America is a more ideological country rather than purely historical one.
Sure.
So actually, this leads to the question of, in general, how is it you came to leave the green and pleasant land and come to America? But I think that's also related to two questions I want you to take on, which is, first, I'm going to put this the way people put it to me, though I know it's not quite the way we think about it necessarily, which is, how did you become an atheist? And then the second is, how did you become a conservative?
Well, I was always an atheist. I've just never believed that there's a God. It wasn't part of my life. I wasn't told there wasn't a God, but it wasn't impressed upon me particularly clearly that there was one. In fact, I can remember being in school when I was maybe 5 and being told the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And my teacher told me this story. Well, she told all of us this story. And I said, oh, so all of the people there they'd brought food, they just didn't want to share it. And then Jesus sort of made them feel guilty. And then they shared it. And she said, no, he made the loaves and he made them. Well, how? Well, he just did. And I thought that doesn't sound very likely. But I mean, again, it's a low voltage thing. I didn't go home and think about it again. So I've always been one. It's never been a big part of my life. I've never been especially angry about it either way. In terms of conservative, that did change. I grew up with a fairly centrist British perspective. I thought all guns should be banned. I thought the National Health Service was good, which you're told in England. That is the national religion, maybe. Yes. I'd never really thought through questions that are quite important. You know, for example, well, why do we have global commerce? You know, and the answer to that question is because the British Empire and then the American Navy underpin it. But I didn't know that. So I didn't really know anything. And also, I'd never really had reason to think about anything political because I was born in 1984. And, you know, by the time that I had any sort of conception of what was going on the radio, we'd gone into the 1990s. Everyone seemed to be happy. Everyone got richer every year. There weren't any big wars, at least not wars that affected me. Right. And so I never thought about it. I was a kid. I had, it was fun. I was interested in movies and, toys and soccer. So that was how my life went until 9/11. And then on 9/11, I suddenly started getting interested in politics, what was going on, why the world looked the way it did. And I mean, a couple of formative moments, I suppose, were it had never crossed my mind that anyone would say that America had it coming. I mean, it wasn't, I loved America, not politically. I had no idea what American politics was like, but I liked America as a place. I'd been a lot. And once that happened, I just assumed, well, of course, everyone is appalled and upset. And then I'm from Cambridge in England. There's a professor. She's brilliant professor called Mary Beard, is a classicist. And she, about a week after 9/11, said on the radio that America deserved it. And I didn't, I thought, what? And then people started saying, well, George Bush is a moron. And I would see him on TV, but he seemed to be the one making sense. I don't mean about invading Iraq. That came later. I just mean, well, look, this was a terrible thing that was done. We need to find the people who did it and stop them. There was a moral clarity there that inspired me to look into the world in a way I never had because I was just ignorant and silly. So when I went to university, I did, and I discovered that actually what I really admired was the classically liberal tradition that had started in England and then had moved through and been ossified in the United States. And after that point, I would say I was a conservative or libertarian or what you will.
Well, putting it that way, I'm a conservative or libertarian or what you will. That sort of leads to my next question, which is being an atheist who's on the right. We've talked about the ways that's consistent with being on the right, but also it does make a difference, I think, in the outlook, in that you describe yourself as a conservatarian, rather famously. Yeah. That it does make you, I think, a little more on the libertarianish end, a little more on the live and let live end of the spectrum.
Sure. not entirely sure it's a product of a lack of religion. I think in general, I'm just skeptical of government and its ability to do good and its ability to intervene without causing other problems. I mean, a great example of this, and this is where I would lean more libertarian than many conservatives, is with the drug war. One of the problems I think that libertarians have is that they have a tendency to pretend that the alternative to whatever the government doing is utopia, is perfection. And it's not. I mean, look, if you take prohibition of alcohol as your example, it is true that the prohibitionists were trying to fix what was a real social problem. Not alcohol per se. I drink a lot of alcohol. I love wine. I'm not anti-alcohol at all. But there were problems. There are problems. There are problems now. People drink and drive. People drink and get violent. There's domestic abuse. You know, we do not live in a perfect world. And it was a lot worse back. The real alcohol got stronger and stronger and stronger. People were drinking as much of it as they had before, which meant they were getting more and more drunk. People would, they'd go to work. They'd go to the bar afterwards, spend all their money, go home, and they'd beat their wife. And there was a reason that there was a great female uprising in favor of prohibition. People were fed up of seeing their husbands squandering their money and hurting them. I totally understand that. But what happened with prohibition was worse than that problem that they were trying to solve. They created organized crime. They made law-abiding people into criminals. They destroyed trust in government. And we know the history of this. And I think if you look at the drug war, I do not take the utopian position that it would be really great if lots of people started taking heroin. It wouldn't. But I think that the consequences of trying to stop them are so deleterious that as a trade-off, it would be worth examining reducing the government's role either completely or a great deal in the economy. Now, I don't think that the economy of drugs. I don't think that my view on that is informed by religion. Although, I mean, maybe it is. Maybe I'm just don't know enough about religious people to know. I think that's more of a hard-headed skepticism that I tend to apply across the board. That I think probably you either have or you don't.
Right. So we talked a little bit about this, touched on this a little bit before, but how have you found yourself being received among conservatives by not being religious? Is this something that's widely tolerated? Is it raised some eyebrows? I mean, you are at National Review, which is sort of the home of fusionism, of trying to combine the religious traditionalism with free markets and make that part of the conservative package.
And to be honest with you, except for a few people on Twitter who said, "Oh, you can't be a conservative if you're not religious," or "I don't want to follow you anymore," it's never really come up. I wonder if I were against religious liberty, I wonder if it would be different. But as somebody who, on conscience grounds, is very much in favor of religious liberty, I've always been welcomed. I mean, I think we've probably reached a point with our political partisanship and our divide, at which those private questions matter less to people than how you vote, and on which side you broadly see yourself.
Yeah. I think in a way that's almost unfortunate that we've reached that point.
Too.
Because
I do too.
Voting and partisanship has taken a greater share. But I also find it interesting that I think part of the reason I've had a similar experience to yours of not getting a lot of grief for not being a believer, but I think it's also because perhaps there's little less sense of ideological competition from an atheist wing of the right. It's too small to be threatening. Whereas, at National Review, you might be aware of the history here, that when Ayn Rand had come out with Atlas Shrugged and her philosophy was first getting influence, there was a sort of attempt to say, let's National Review famously published a very negative review. And I think there was a little bit more of the sense that, William F. Buckley was trying to put together this fusionism of religious tradition with free markets and being an anti-communist hawk. And I think there was more of a sense that we have to keep these people out because they're going to disrupt that project. But I think that project has been complete enough and successful enough that there isn't as much the sense of competition.
I think that's right, but I would also separate out Ayn Rand from, say, Russell Kirk. So Ayn Rand's view was hostile to religion. I mean, she insulted Buckley on these grounds. She said that he was, too smart to be a Catholic. Yeah. So you can see why he might not have wanted her around. But Russell Kirk, on the other hand, I think his view was more, I don't say this in the way they say to Oberlin, but offensive to people who aren't religious, right? Because if you read Russell Kirk, he is essentially saying you can't be a conservative. You can't be with us if you're not religious. Right. And I directly refute that. But I just think we've moved on. I mean, I think the center balance of conservatism doesn't include that preconception anymore. It's gone. Maybe it has to because we've become less religious as a society. Maybe the questions of how religion and the government intersect are narrower. Maybe conservatives are so desperate for adherence.
Well, yeah, I do think that there's the people I know who are religious who are on the right, they're more in a sort of almost defensive mode. It's like they're in a survival mode, especially with things like gay marriage and the sense that you're going to be persecuted for your religious beliefs. And that sort of leads me to, I think that's one of the explanations for the rise of Trump is they see him as this, he's not somebody who would be embraced by the religious right for his personal life and for his personal morality or personal style necessarily, but he's embraced as a fighter for that side. And I thought it was interesting what Ross Douthat said a while back is that if you want to know what a secular right looks like, Trumpism is a secular right. Now, I disagree with that, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis of, I view it more as a non-ideological right rather than a secular right.
Well, I think it's rational too. I mean, look, you and I are not fans of the president, but he has fulfilled a role for believers that I think is understandable, and I think that their decision to back him has been comprehensible and arguably necessary. Where I think religious people have gone off the deep end is in their, and this isn't true of all of them, but it is true of far too many religious institutions and religiously based institutions, is in their defense of his conduct, his private conduct, his history, his comments. But it is entirely rational to say, look, the other side is vehemently anti-religion. The other side does not believe that religious liberty should be broadly construed, but instead that we have a right to pray in our own homes quietly, but not live our faith out. The other side is going after bakers. The other side is going after free expression, and we need Trump or a Republican president, nameless Republican president, to stand in their way. I think that is again, I'm not a fan of his. I'm not religious, so this isn't really something that affects me personally. But I think that is an entirely rational position to take. Now, unfortunately, it's not always manifested that way. That would be the cynical realpolitik way of putting it. But often the people who have taken that view feel the need to justify Trump across the board, or even to say, which is preposterous, well, I think he was sent by God. God sends people in these packages. Nonsense. Why? It is fine for you to want him as a bulwark against encroachment. But let's not pretend he's a good person, because he's not.
Well, and I also think there's too much of an attempt to still justify that none of the other nameless Republican presidents, of the other option we had, would have done the same thing. And I think a lot of them, certainly a lot of them would have.
Nonsense. Yeah. I mean, if you want to sort of bag on John Kasich, fine, I'll sign me up. But I really do not see any universe in which President Rubio or President Cruz or President Jeb Bush wouldn't have taken the same tack on religious liberty, wouldn't have appointed the same judges, wouldn't have had the same respect for religious people. This is a Republican position, and yes, there are some heretics, if you'll excuse the word, but they're not likely to win the presidency or the primary anytime soon.
Now, I'm a little more concerned about sort of the influence of Trump and the connection between him and the religious right, because I think there is a big question it raises, which is, is America defined? It's the question of nationalism. It's the question of, is America defined by ideas, or is it defined by identity, which it can include racial identity, can also include religious identity.
Yeah.
So, there are the sort of people who believe, we need to maintain it as a Christian nation. And that's sort of, it's really the Putin model. And that's why people are concerned about his sympathy with Putin, is that there is this model rising up again, a sort of a nationalist model in Eastern Europe of saying we're going to maintain the identity of our country as a Christian nation.
Yeah, yeah. That does bother me, but I think that it reminds me more than anything that that I am just on a limb. I mean, because the alternative, the realistic electoral alternative to Trump is not what I want, or I assume what you want. The realistic alternative to Trump electorally is progressivism as a religion. Now, that's not a justification for voting for Trump or voting for progressivism, don't get me wrong. But the people who want to see the United States as a primarily ideas-driven place, a place of diversity, not of skin color, which is the most boring thing about a person, but of outlook, of geography, of community, those people are losing at the moment. They're losing to the sort of Trumpite worldview, but they're also losing to the identity politics worldview on the left. Again, I can understand why religious people look at Trump and say, well, we have to choose him. I just don't think that it bodes particularly well for everyone else long term. It is sort of a Putinist model, but one of the nice things about America, unlike Russia, is that we do have still a strong and intact First Amendment. Right. We have a strong culture of classical liberalism, and it seems to me that Trump's vision of nationalism is actually not that popular. It's just unfortunately popular enough to have put him in charge of the Republican Party in the same way as the strange worldview that a Kamala Harris has may be enough to put her in charge of the Democratic Party, and we all have to live under it. But I don't see this as a bottom-up movement.
So you think that it's likely, this has happened before, that you have a personality who promotes a certain viewpoint and that becomes popular, and then as that personality passes off the political scene, it fades away, and you get some new personality who comes up and moves the party back in a different way. So it may not be a permanent.
Yeah, I do think that. I also think that if we end up with a Republican Party that is more nationalist, that is more attuned to white working class voters, in the long run, I think it's going to look more like Tom Cotton than Donald Trump. And I think that Putin connection probably dies with Trump insofar as it exists at all.
Yeah. Now, one last thing I want to talk about is we've talked a little bit about, I think you said a few things about what atheists have to offer the right in terms of being able to offer a secular argument that is convincing to a larger number of people in what is an increasingly secular society.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it. If you take, for example, the question of abortion, I mean, I've always been an atheist and I've always been pro-life. And you do the math. That means that I'm not an atheist, pro-life, because I'm religious. So to me, this has always been a question that is totally divorced from metaphysics, that is totally divorced from religious texts, that is totally divorced from catechism. This has been, for me, a position arrived at after, I mean, study sounds grandiose, but after examination. And, it is a problem for the right. It's also, of course, good. I mean, it's one of the reasons they have so many pro-life adherents is that there are so many religious people on the right. But it's also a problem that a lot of their rhetoric is couched in religious terms. because the argument in favor of life and against abortion does not require that at all. And I agree. I think that atheist pro-life conservatives have a great deal to bring in explaining why it is that they oppose this practice, without immediately excluding those who aren't within the club. And I actually think the same thing obtains with the founding. Again, I don't mind the idea that our rights derive from God, because the founders believed that too. But our rights, per the founders, did not derive from Jesus. They did not derive from the Catholic Church. They did not derive from, Lutherans or what you will. They derived from nature's God. And the atheists within the movement are probably better placed to explain what nature's God means in practice and why natural law should be respected, and what historical touch points led the founders to make the judgments that they did, than those who have absorbed that phrase without thinking about it. I just want to be very, very clear here that I'm not suggesting religious people don't think about these questions at all. I'm not. I mean, look, much smarter than I, people much smarter than I are devout, including many of my colleagues. But if you don't believe in God and you also believe that rights have been protected by nature's God, you have to do the legwork and work out what it is that you actually think. And once you've done that, you're well placed to explain to others what you think. So yeah, I think atheists have a role to play.
Well, I'm very interested in the fact that, if you go back 150 years, well, I'm a big fan of an obscure political movement called the Locofocos. Okay. They were radical New York City Democrats in 1835, and they were laissez-faire. Now, think of that difference, that they were an urban faction, radical Democrats who were laissez-faire, and you have to think what changed in the last 150 years that free markets and the Constitution and limited government, small government, used to be the sort of elite urban opinion among the intellectual leaders, and the one of the leaders of the Locofocos was an editor of the New York Post who started out as a theater critic, right? Yeah. Sort of Frank Rich's trajectory, but on a totally different ideological side. So that's sort of the way I look at it, is that recapturing this sense of free markets and limited government and constitutional government and that sort of thing, which has all the arguments on its side and ought to be the elite opinion of the educated, intelligent, thinking person, which today, strangely, for some reason, despite having so much support for it, is not the opinion of the sort of elite thinking person.
But it strips power, if you believe that. Mm-hmm. It strips your power. I mean, I say this half tongue-in-cheek, but the most dangerous people you will ever meet are the people coming out of public policy master's degrees. Because they've spent their money and time studying how to tell people what to do, how to set systems up as they think they should be run. And the last thing they want is the implementation of neutral rules that render them impotent. It's the last thing they want. I don't mean that they all have ambitions to be Mussolini. They don't. But it's a scary proposition to be told, well, you don't get to tell everyone else what to do, and also I can't tell you how things are going to work out. I mean, look, imagine, if you will, a debate between a libertarian-leaning presidential candidate and a interventionist-leaning presidential candidate in our current media environment. It's a town hall event. Somebody stands up and they say, and I'm in no way casting aspersions upon the person asking the question. They say, I have a question for the two candidates. I'm a single mother and I have a fixed income, and I'm worried about the future. Can you tell me what you are going to do to make my life better and alleviate my worries? I mean, who do you want to be on the stage at that point? Do you want to be the candidate who says, yes, I'm going to implement this law, which will help you at your job, and this law, which will raise the minimum wage, and this law, which will do this for childcare, and this law, which will give you subsidy, and this retraining program, and da 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 da. You want to be that person? Or do you want to be the candidate who says, I don't know. I don't know who will employ you. I don't know who will fix. I don't know how the growth will help you. I don't know how the incentives that we will set up will directly affect you. But let me tell you that over the last 100 years, it is my worldview that has led to the alleviation of misery and poverty on a scale that nobody can imagine or has ever beaten. And it is the ideology of my opponent that has led to stagnation. You can't do it. I mean, it's just,
I think it's doable, but I think it is. You're right. They've managed to couch it in a way that makes it seem like we have the answers. We're going to, we feel your pain. We have the answers. We're going to solve things for you. We're taking action. And it is harder to say, to point out, well, here's the ways in which getting out of your way is going to help you. Getting out of people's way is going to help you. It is more indirect. But, there is a whole body of free market economics, a whole body of history that you can draw on. And there's a lot of, I think one of my hobby horses is the most interesting anti-regulatory crusade right now is being done by a bunch of millennial liberals. And it's the YIMBY movement. I don't know if you've heard about this, the Yes in My Backyard. The people who figured out that the reason why they will never be able to afford a home in Seattle, you have these craftsman houses built 100 years ago for steel workers, and they cost $1.5 million to buy one now. And it's because of the government regulations and the zoning regulations and all the things that have artificially restricted the supply. I think it's fascinating to me that people have figured this out and they've actually made a popular and populist campaign about it. So I think that sort of thing is possible. But I think that, it takes a lot of work to figure out how to do it successfully.
It also takes things to get bad, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at Margaret Thatcher and her remarkable career, she was not elected in 1979 because people were suddenly converted to Hayek, or because people looked at her free market beliefs and said, yes, that is what I believe too. They weren't. They were angry because we had rolling blackouts and trash piling up in the street and people weren't being buried and the unions were out of control and there were strikes all the time and you couldn't get anything. It took 3 months to get a telephone unless you were a doctor, and you could, So yes, by 1987, there were a lot of people who were converted to that sort of Wall Street Journal editorial page mindset. Yeah, there were, but there weren't in the first instance. And I think the same is true in America. I think Ronald Reagan in 1980 did not win because the country suddenly believed that we needed to deregulate everything. They won because Jimmy Carter seemed weak and feckless and didn't have a plan to end the Cold War, and the economy was stagnant, and we had terrible inflation. By the end of his tenure, Newt Gingrich could stand up on a stage and sell free market ideas and not lose elections as a result. In fact, win elections. So yeah, I take your point. I think in Seattle, and to a lesser extent in the Bay Area, that is true. But that there is always the problem of people who are elite and well educated do seek power. And, with a government as big as it is a shortcut to gaining power to take the levers. It takes far less work than operating within a free market, unfortunately. And they're drawn to that shortcut because it makes them feel good, too. They can tell everyone what to do.
Well, one last thing I want to figure out, which is we talked about how atheism is good for the right in terms of being able to create the secular arguments and that are going to be convincing in an increasingly secular society. I also think that the right is good for atheism, in a sense, in that atheism does get something of a bad name because of the associations with, what have been the big atheist movements of the past. Or what is if you look at predominantly the caricature of a secular person. I mean, I'm a little older than you, so when I was young, I was a teenager in the 80s, and we had, the secular humanists were the favorite bogeyman of a lot of politicians. And I had to admit, the secular humanists, such as they were at the time, did not exactly cover themselves in glory. Often they were far to the left. They were sympathetic to communism, sympathetic to tyranny. So I do think that the idea of making promoting this idea that you can be pro-liberty, you can be pro-constitutionalist, you can be in favor of limited government, and not go off the deep end into subjectivism while being secular.
Yeah, I also think that religious people are good for, and the right is good for atheists in that probably the founding principle of the right is that human nature is immutable. I mean, if I look at what separates the right and the left ultimately, it is the belief on the right that you cannot create new Soviet man. Now, in religion, that is rendered differently. That, you know, either you believe people are born with original sin, or what you will. But again, you don't have to be religious to believe that. But I think being around people who very strongly believe that human nature is immutable is good for atheists, because there is a tendency to conceive of human beings as a blank slate, and the consequences of that belief historically have been disastrous, absolutely disastrous.
I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, Locke was an example of someone who believed that humans began as a blank slate, but not in the same sense that, you know, human nature was mutable and could be completely changed, but in the sense that you didn't have ideas preloaded. The software doesn't come preloaded. You have to figure things out.
Not ideas, no. But Woodrow Wilson's critique of the Constitution was that it was old. That it, you know, he said this was written when we didn't even have the telephone. And of course, it's a silly criticism because it wasn't a telephone manual. It was a manual to counteract ambition. And the founders understood, and I think conservatives understand, this is when they're at their best, that there is no difference in the scale of individual ambition, irrespective of where in history you sit. And they knew a lot, not just about the British, but they knew a lot about the Greeks, they knew a lot about the Romans, and more. And they understood that there was the same temptation within Roman society as there would be within the new United States. There was the same temptation within Greek society as there would be within the new United States, and that you needed some sort of structure to contain that ambition and that temptation and that tendency toward evil even. And I think that the progressivism doesn't believe that. Progressivism believes that you can remake people. And religious people don't believe that you can remake people. And that is a good part of their belief system.
Yeah.
I
find it to be a complicated question, though, because in a sense, you know, there are examples of moral reform movements where we have remade people in some specific respect. Like, you know, I live in the South, where I'm a transplant to Virginia, where, you know, it was somewhat of a shock to me to discover somebody talking about there's a train station right nearby here, an old train station, and they were pointing out this was the colored waiting room and this was the white waiting room, waiting room. You know, back from the days of segregation. I didn't grow up with that above the Mason-Dixon line. So there have been cases where things were regarded as normal, and there was a moral reform movement, and it was changed. But so I think that, you know, people look at that and say, well, we've changed things in the past. We can change whether you're a man or a woman. And so there's an interesting sort of philosophical question to pick apart about which part of your human nature, you know, so human nature can be taken to mean just whatever people have an urge to do. And that's not immutable. But there is an aspect of human nature that is immutable, that, you know, people have choices to make between good and evil, that they are not automatically good, that they're going to possibly become ambitious. So there's aspects of human nature that are changed, that I think this comes back to the Enlightenment roots of America, that there was this attempt to sort of figure out, separate what is mere custom versus what is human nature that's immutable. Yeah. And there was a side of that said everything's custom.
Yeah, I know. I more meant that people can be changed in their substantive viewpoints over time, which is why nobody really believes that slavery is a good thing now. I agree with you on that. What I don't think changes is the desire of human beings to gain power when given an opportunity to exercise it. That, I think, is constant. And one of the problems the left has, it's not entirely limited to the left, but it is a bigger problem with the left, is that they are more open to the idea that we should have a system without balances and without checks because the right person may come along. Or maybe a kinder way of putting it would be when the right person comes along, they don't care about those checks and balances anymore.
I think that's a better way to put it, because that really explains our current politics. Why they're very concerned about constitutional checks and balances at the current moment, because the wrong person's in power. But 3 years ago, when the right person was in power, they were less concerned. So changing immigration law by executive order is bad now. It was good then.
And a perfect example of this in the literature, as they say, is Marx. I mean, we've all had that argument with the guy who says communism hasn't been tried, right? And then they say, well, what would it look like? And they say, well, for a start, it's entirely voluntary. And you think, well, human beings are never, ever, ever going to behave as described in Marx. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry, but they believe that you can make that if you try hard enough. And unfortunately, and people like Eric Hobsbawm said this explicitly. That often comes after the mass killings. Mm-hmm. Well, if we just murder the right people, if we get rid of the kulaks, then we can put people out of these sort of historical and savage instincts. But you can't do it. And conservatives, I think, do better at grasping that, and religious people do better at grasping that than their opponents.
Well, thanks for talking to me. I appreciate you taking the time.
Of course, thank you. I enjoyed it.
My guest has been Charles C.W. Cooke of National Review. This is Rob Tracinski. You've been watching Salon of the Refused. You can support us at Patreon under Salon of the Refused, or you can find out more information at the Tracinski Letter, tracinskiletter.com. Don't worry about how to spell that. There'll be a link included with this video. Thank you for watching.